So we're going to use this 2017 release test question to kind of frame our conversation about question 2, just to kind of hit the review. On Friday, we talked about question 1. We spent a lot of time on the effect of that synthesis question requiring you to take the sources and kind of synthesize your argument based on that. When we look at rhetorical analysis, it's very different because for this, we have to return back more solidly to our rhetorical framework. And so we want to keep that in mind for what the task is. And we'll come back to that rhetorical framework in a moment. Let's start by taking a look at the prompt together, talking a little bit there, and then giving you a chance to read the passage before we start to look at next steps. So here they tell you that the passage below is the opening to a speech made in 1960 by American journalist and politician Clare Boothe Luce to journalists at the Women's National Press Club. In this speech, Luce went on to criticize the tendency of the American press to sacrifice journalistic integrity in favor of the perceived public demand for sensationalist stories. Read the passage carefully. Then, in a well-developed essay, analyze how Luce uses this introduction to prepare the audience for her message. Support your analysis of her rhetoric with specific references to the text. So as we start to look at how these prompts are built, they do like to give background to students on the rhetorical analysis question just to help them to focus. We were just talking about taking AP exams. And so if you took any last week, you kind of are familiar with that brain muddled feeling that you have in there. It's a combination of stress. It's a combination of having to think quickly. And it's also just you being nervous. They want to try to get your brain focused to give you some things to think about. So here, it's 1960, and we're talking about a female journalist speaking at the Women's National Press Club. So ask yourself quickly and make some assumptions. Do you think there are a lot of female journalists at the time? No. Would they become empowered by having their own professional organization like this? Yes. And so where they may not always be able to speak a truth aloud, this would give them a safe space to do so. And so we do want to consider that. We know here that she is going to criticize the tendency of the American press to sacrifice journalistic integrity in favor of a perceived public demand for sensationalist stories. So as a junior in high school, do you know what journalistic integrity is? Some of you may, but for a lot of you, do you? And that's where I know I'm just picking because I can see a couple of you like, no, why would I? I'm a junior in high school. How would I know what journalistic integrity is? We have to remember that on this test, there is that bias in favor of kids that know stuff. And so if you maybe can't put it to words, you at least should be able to define integrity to kind of know that basic idea of being true to yourself, of having a standard. And when we combine it with a journalistic concept, having sources, checking references, having some credibility in what you're publishing versus here, a sensationalist story. Something that is going to get attention. We often think now of the word clickbait. So here we've got to look at how, and notice here we are tagging different words. Question 1 focused on synthesizing your argument based on the sources. Here we've got to analyze how. So we've got to look at this text and figure out not just what the message is, but how that message is constructed. And here we want to look at how this introduction prepares the audience for her message. And we know that the message is here. So she may not get to this point here, but we want to see what in here gets them ready to hear this. So we want to think. We always want to tag. What's our verb? What do we notice? Analyze how. Let's take a few minutes to just read the passage. And as we read, we want to consider a couple of basic things. We know roughly our audience. We understand the exigence here as well. She's giving this speech in 1960. She wants to kind of criticize. She has this perceived concept. This is what people want. This is what we feel like we should have. So we've got to think purpose too. It's here. So as we start to look, we want to think, what are those intentional choices she makes? Don't go get lost in the weeds on specific tools she uses, the bottom of the rhetorical framework. Think about what you notice as you look through here. So take a couple of minutes to read it, and when we come back together, we're going to answer a couple of questions. What does the speaker have to say? How does she do it? So take a few minutes, read, take some notes. We will put it together. Anybody need more time with this? Everybody's good. Okay. So as we start to look here at our speech, we do have to remember that our task, like we said, is to analyze how. Because we are focused there, our task is not to summarize this speech. So in your essay, if all that you are doing is qualifying or summarizing, we are going to score on the lower end here, and we are likely not in line to get credit for this test. Our task here is to figure out how she uses the introduction to prepare the audience for her message. We know roughly what her message is going to be because they tell us that she is going to go on to do this. I know I did it on camera too. So as we look here, our task is to figure out what are those little bits that we notice that she's getting her audience ready to hear this message. If you had to describe her tone and approach, what's something that stands out to you about it? What does she understand about her audience? One, they're all fellow journalists. Remember, we know this because here we know she's speaking to the Women's National Press Club. What does she know about how they're going to feel about her message? Yeah.
She's like, just remember that you asked for this.
She's really open with, just remember, you invited me to speak on this. And so she understands that likely this is going to be uncomfortable because she's going to have to critique her peers. She's going to have to look in this way. Hard conversations are never easy to have. And so what are some of the lines, the moments that you notice that stand out to you where she's really being clear about kind of what she understands this is going to be like?
Line 50.
So what to you stands out here with this section here about line 50?
She says, in my perilous but earnest effort. So like she knows that she's kind of putting herself at risk, but she knows that this needs to be said.
Yeah, look at that word earnest, that idea of honest and forthright. It's tough, but I got to do it. Notice that she's also, if you wanted to go a little further with it, do you notice that she's trying to balance as well? She understands this is going to be uncomfortable, but she's saying there's a lot that's wrong, but there's also much that's right. And so she's clearly indicating to her audience, we're going to have to be critical, but we're also going to be fair. We're not just going to attack and bash. Any other lines that you're kind of looking at that you're going, oh, this really does show her understanding of her audience and kind of preparing them for what she's going to do? Line 18. That whole paragraph here.
She's talking about, she's like, you're a journalist, and so yeah, she's like, remember that you asked for it, and also you wouldn't like it anyways if I just told you how great you were.
Yeah, she also gives this idea of like, you know, she understands her audience. She says, there's no audience anywhere who should be more bored by a speaker who tried to fawn on it, butter it up, exaggerate its virtues, play down its faults, and who would more quickly see through any attempt to do so. She's kind of acknowledging to them, you don't want somebody to come here and kiss your butt. You wouldn't recognize, you wouldn't respond to that well. Think about how we all can kind of fawn off if we wanted to tag this idea of earnestness that you brought up. Remember, speeches are developed. It's not just one line. We see how they play with ideas. If we talk about this earnestness, look at how she's playing it up here. We know when we're getting spoken to in a way by somebody that they're just totally fake. They're putting on a pretense. They're just trying to make us feel a certain way. And we're like, God, ugh. Stop being so positive about everything. Stop being so happy about everything. We know we get there. Just tagging it there. What else do you notice?
line 41, that entire paragraph.
Okay.
She starts out being forgiving and like clarifying, hey, it's okay to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is when you don't try. So she's being forgiving and then critical.
Yeah, there's a forgiving and critical kind of end to this. And notice too, she even acknowledges no audience knows better than an audience of journalists that the pursuit of truth, the articulation of it, is the most delicate, hazardous, exacting, and inexactive task. Let's go back up here. We said, hey, you're a junior that's sitting in this test. What if you don't know what journalistic integrity is? Can you get some ideas out of how she articulates the field of journalism in this introduction to be able to put to what are things that they feel are important? Yeah, look right here. Pursuit of truth, to articulate it, to do those things. You're like, oh, okay, I can definitely help to frame my understanding there. We want to make sure that we pay attention to how these things work together. I would even go down here to this rhetorical question that she asks. This is line 26. What's good journalism all about? What do you think is the word that she wants to hit hardest there to help to kind of bring this tone forward? Good. If we're looking at this idea of integrity, if we're looking at this idea of how we're going to be critical, she's really going to ask this. But again, with a rhetorical question, do you frame a rhetorical question that you don't know the answer to? Do you put that out there that you're not in control of what's going to come back? No. It's why usually women feel comfortable asking questions like, do I look fat in this? Because they know that a guy isn't going to look at them and be like, yeah, you look like a sausage that's bursting its casing. Most guys aren't going to do that. They're going to be like, no, you look great. You're perfect. Okay. They don't put that question out there unless they know how it's going to come back. And so here, think about the fact that she understands that audience. She knows what she wants to lead them to. If you want to be critical, you get someone to realize that fault early so that you're not the one beating them up. They've already got it in their head. As we start to look at this, are you noticing that we're focusing on specific lines, specific choices, but we're always going back to how that information actually gets the audience ready? We're never just going, look, here's a line, and going, see, she talks about integrity. See, she's going to criticize her audience. We're tying it together to talk about how. When we analyze, that is our purpose. We've got to explain to someone else who doesn't see how this works. And so as we start to make the jump now to go, okay, what do we do with this? We've got to start to look at, hey, framing out a thesis, hey, framing out a line of reasoning. And so this is a great chance that we can start to build there. I want to give you a couple of minutes just to kind of, on your Chromebook, if you want to get out a scrap piece of paper, take a couple of minutes to like rough out. How would you approach writing a thesis to address this prompt? We want to keep in mind a couple of things with writing that thesis. One, we've got to articulate how she's preparing the audience for her message. So in that thesis, we probably want to have something about what is her message, how is she getting them ready for what she's going to say. And think more about some of those things that we said. She knows that she's going to have to be critical, but she has this other side to her. She's going to try to be fair about it. Think about that line of reasoning. What are the specific choices and chunks we see here that help us to do it? Don't point out the tools. Some of us got stuck in the weeds as we've written question twos where we want to focus on diction. We want to write a whole paragraph about imagery. Look at the choices that she makes. Look at the chunks in the passage that help us to see. They're going to help to frame our paragraphs. And then our tools, our diction, our imagery, our syntax, our figurative language, our metaphors, our stuff like that, they're going to build up the evidence that we use in those paragraphs. They're not going to make up the paragraph topic as a whole. So take a couple of minutes, see what you can come up with for a thesis. We're going to talk about how we would put that together and sort of where we would go and try to give some coaching on good versus better thesis statements. Everybody about ready? Let's start to look at like how we can frame out this thesis to be effective and how we can make sure we do a couple of things that our rubric is going to look for at higher grade levels. So the first thing we want to do, of course, is to kind of identify for our reader our rhetorical situation. So here we identify our speaker, our mode of presentation. So here it's a speech. Sometimes it may be a letter, a commencement address, whatever. We identify our audience. Now, we said, since this is the Women's National Press Club, we likely could guess that this is going to be a majority of females in the audience, but can we assume that? No. And so notice even in your prompt, it says journalists in general. So we don't want to go, as she speaks to nothing but women. At the end of the day, think about this. Does the speech matter in terms of the audience that it has to be all women? Does she say anything about, your Y chromosomes lead you to doing, or your double X chromosomes lead you to doing this? Oh, so if it doesn't, leave it there. We're good. So we identify those pieces. Here we get that basic bit. Here's our rhetorical situation. We can then chunk into the second part of our thesis. This is where we want to think, hey, what's the meaning? And this is where we can kind of bring in that analysis bit. If we look at what I have here, I intentionally left some things out. We're going to talk about that. We say Luce prepares her audience for an examination of their roles as journalists. We definitely agree with that. That's what she's doing here. She's going to talk about it. But what I left off are our adjectives before we talk about what this examination is. When we look at how we can frame this as an argument, as an analysis, the way we see that meaning being developed, the way we would describe her approach, her tone, her whatever, is our way of making that statement to say, this is the argument that we see. I see her as speaking in this way. And everything I'm going to write about is going to frame that understanding of how I see it. So the words that I came up with were to say that she is going to give a critical yet fair examination. What are some other words we could use here? We don't have to use two different words. But what are some other constructions we can use to describe the way she's going to give this speech? It's okay.
But part of mine, I thought the end was giving them a sense of purpose to better themselves as American journalists who are already part of the press that is the best in the world. Does she mention that?
Yeah. No, that's a perfect way. And notice here, just because I'm kind of framing it this way does not mean, hey, this is the way you need to write this. Absolutely not. That's the beauty of this being an argument about the analysis. You can see it one way as focused on nationalistic tendencies. We are the American press. Here's how we can improve. Absolutely. I can view it this way. I can still be right. But if we went to this and we said, Luce is giving a speech to secretly turn everyone into Satan worshipers. Is that what this speech is? No. There, you're wrong. Students often get really frustrated with that because they don't like that two different people can frame this argument in two different ways, both be right, and yet they're wrong. Drives some people crazy. So yeah, even though you framed it that way, 100%. Some other words that I didn't use. Hannah, the word that you brought up. Earnest. If we can talk about this as an earnest examination of their roles as journalists, do you think it's effective to use her own wording in the speech to help to frame your understanding of what it is? Yeah. Because if we're trying to figure out and examine how she builds this meaning, if we can find the word that articulates the meaning to us in the speech, it's going to help because guess what? She's already building to it. Anybody have different words that they could sub in here that they think, oh, that would be a really good one? Could use words, and again, we're just kind of playing the semantic game here. We could call it honest. We could call it tough. To say it's a tough examination of their roles? Yeah. The word here doesn't matter. Notice that I put it in a color. Why? Because it helps to color the argument you're going to make. For those of you that have struggled and you're like, I feel like all I'm doing is summarizing the piece, it's because you're not putting it into a perspective. How should we view this? Our last step is then to establish our line of reasoning. If we've identified who's speaking, if we talk about what it is we're supposed to get away from it, we then got to figure out how they do it. That's how we answer the last part here. The way that I articulated it in the one that I wrote. And if you're like, did you really write it? Yup. While they were working. No prep before. Notice that I even have stuff crossed out on here. I put that, what do we have? How is she doing this? So I really looked at it from what are the things that came up in our conversation and how could we word this in? So how does she do it? Well, I would probably build a paragraph to discuss how she acknowledges her role as the invited speaker. We see in multiple places in this speech that we pointed out. She acknowledges, you asked for this. I'm here. I know how you want to hear this. So I would be looking at different ways that she does that to get them to see her critical yet fair approach. Second, there are multiple times that she identifies the shared ideals of her audience. If we're looking at how we organize a speech and how we bring this together for purpose, we want to look at what are the things that we all believe. And we said that comes up at different moments here, that if you didn't understand what journalistic integrity meant when you read the prompt, you might be able to better articulate some values after reading this introduction. And lastly, to evaluate the concept of the role of truth in journalism. This is where I would bring up things like, hey, that rhetorical question about good journalism. I would bring up her whole part about truth in the right-hand column. We notice that all of these are big organizing ways that we support this critical yet fair examination of journalism. And we can use this idea of truth as her way to say, sensationalism doesn't necessarily guarantee our journalistic integrity. Truth does. When we look here, do you see how effectively I've got the three parts that these prompts, that these rubrics are really looking for seated here? Did I spend a ton of time writing this? When we broke, it took us what, 5 minutes? Look at what you have on your screen. I asked you to kind of sketch your ideas. It doesn't have to look like this. But do you have how you're going to approach this? Do you have an answer to the question? And do you have some basic kind of focusing for your reader so that they know what you're going to do? If we do, this is time well spent in your pre-writing, because now when you start to write the actual essay, you know what you're going to say. You have an idea of what your paragraphs are going to be, versus for some of you, you get so worked up because you feel like I have to go. And you start writing off the top of your head and you just don't know what to do. Taking the 5 minutes to write this thesis before you start your essay is going to help to control the essay as a whole. I promise. Even though you might freak out about the time, it will make a big difference as we move. So tomorrow we will look at question 3.